Under a grey evening sky, a wealthy man with a harsh look pulls up his luxury car at the gate of an old cemetery far from downtown. In the back seat, his 18-year-old son, paralyzed from the waist down, grips the arms of his wheelchair, staring at an open grave. The father claims it's a tribute to his late wife, but there are no flowers, no family. After a few slow steps, he pushes his son straight into the hole. In the distance, a white horse leaps over a rusty fence and races through. The tombstones, its hooves echoing in the still air. What happens next, no one is ready for. Love stories with animals? Then subscribe now and don't miss out. Thanks for following along. Now, back to the story. The first thing Ethan Mitchell ever remembered feeling was his father's disappointment. Not as a concept, as a tangible thing, heavy and cold like the Kentucky morning fog that rolled over the Mitchell estate's manicured lawns. It came in the silence, in the closed doors, in the way his father's eyes slid past him, as if trying not to acknowledge the wheelchair that had been part of Ethan since birth. Congenital paralysis of the lower limbs, the doctors had said, in the sterile brightness of the hospital room where Ethan had entered the world. Richard Mitchell, third-generation thoroughbred mogul and pillar of Lexington high society, had simply turned away from his newborn son and walked out. No questions asked, no tears shed, just the sound of expensive leather shoes clicking down. The hallway, already distancing themselves from what he considered a fundamental flaw in his legacy. The grand Victorian mansion that housed the Mitchells stood proudly on 70 acres of prime bluegrass country. To tourists driving by, it represented the quintessential American success story: old money built on faster horses and shrewd business deals. Inside its walls, however, 10-year-old Ethan lived a life of calculated invisibility. "Your father has guests arriving at 6, Mrs. Pembroke, the housekeeper, said as she straightened Ethan's room. "He's requested that you remain in the East Wing tonight." Ethan nodded, accustomed to this routine. The East Wing meant the furthest possible distance from the main entertaining areas. It meant dinner on a tray instead of at the massive oak table. It meant pretending not to exist so his father's business associates and social circle could maintain the illusion that Richard Mitchell had been cruelly robbed of his chance at fatherhood when his wife Grace died of a sudden aneurysm 3 years after Ethan's birth. What few knew was that Grace had been Ethan's only advocate, the buffer between him and Richard's cold indifference. Her death had sealed Ethan's fate as the mansion's ghost, wheeling silently through corridors designed to keep him hidden. "Can I go to the stables after breakfast?" Ethan asked, his small voice practiced in the art of asking without seeming to ask too much. Mrs. Pembroke's face softened momentarily. "I'll have Samuel bring the modified cart around. 1 hour, mind you. Your tutor will be here at 11. The stables were a relic of the estate's past glory days. While Richard had built a state-of-the-art racing facility on the other side of the property, where he entertained investors and showcased his championship thoroughbreds, the old stable remained largely forgotten, housing retired horses or those deemed unsuitable for racing. Samuel, the aging stable hand who had worked for the Mitchells since Richard was a boy, waited with the specially adapted cart that allowed Ethan to navigate the gravel paths to the stables. At 73, Samuel's hands were gnarled from decades of labor, but they were gentle as he helped Ethan from his wheelchair into the cart. "Morning, young master," he said, his voice a gravelly comfort in Ethan's silent world. "The old boy's been waiting for you." "Has he eaten?" Ethan asked, his eyes already searching the stable's shadowy interior. Barely touched his feed until he heard the cart coming. Inside, past the rows of mostly empty stalls, in the last space on the left, stood Redemption. Once valued at over $2 million as a yearling with impeccable bloodlines, the Bay Stallion had destroyed his racing career with a single misstep at the Belmont Stakes 3 years ago. The fall had left him with a pronounced scar across his forehead and a permanently damaged front leg that ended any dreams his owners had of recouping their investment. Richard had purchased him at auction for a fraction of his former value, not out of compassion, but as a tax write-off and potential breeding prospect. When the breeding also proved unsuccessful, Redemption had been relegated to the old stables, largely forgotten by everyone except Samuel and Ethan. The moment Ethan appeared in the doorway, the horse's head lifted, his ears pricked forward, and he made a soft, nickering sound that seemed reserved only for the boy. "Hey, Red," Ethan said, using the nickname he'd given the stallion. "Sorry I'm late." Samuel positioned the cart close enough that Ethan could reach through the stall bars. The connection was immediate, the soft muzzle against his palm, warm breath against his skin. In those moments, Ethan felt none of the limitations that defined his existence in the main house. Here, with Redemption, he wasn't the mistake, the burden, the secret kept in the East Wing. He was simply a boy with a friend. "He understands you," Samuel observed, not for the first time. "Horses know things about people that people don't even know about themselves." Over the past 2 years, since Samuel had first brought Ethan to see the injured stallion, an unspoken bond had formed between boy and horse. Both damaged in the eyes of the world, both relegated to the forgotten corners of Richard Mitchell's empire, both finding in each other a recognition that transcended their circumstances. "Samuel," Ethan said, his voice hesitant as he stroked Redemption's nose. "Do you think I could learn to ride him?" The old man stilled, considering the boy's words carefully. "Your daddy wouldn't approve." "My daddy doesn't approve of me breathing," Ethan replied, with a bluntness that made Samuel wince, "but that doesn't stop me doing it." Something shifted in Samuel's weathered face. Recognition, perhaps, that the quiet, compliant child was harboring a spirit far stronger than anyone had given him credit for. "It would take special equipment," Samuel said slowly, "and we'd need to work with Red to make sure he understands. He's got a strong spirit in him still." "So do I," Ethan said, and for the first time, Samuel saw Grace Mitchell's determination shining through her son's eyes. The following weeks unfolded in stolen moments of freedom. Samuel called in a favor from a cousin who worked with therapeutic riding programs in Louisville. Together, they modified an old saddle with supports that would compensate for Ethan's lack of leg control. In the privacy of the early morning hours, before the main stable staff arrived, they began the slow process of training both Redemption and Ethan. The first time Ethan sat astride Redemption's broad back, feeling the horse's muscles shift beneath him, something fundamental changed in his understanding of himself. His legs might not work, but seated on Redemption, with Samuel leading them in gentle circles around the small paddock behind the old stables, Ethan experienced movement that came from connection rather than mechanism. Not the cold metal of his wheelchair, but the living warmth of a creature who chose to carry him. "You're a natural, just like your mama was," Samuel said, a rare smile breaking across his face. "She used to ride these hills before dawn," said, "it was when the world was most honest." Ethan absorbed this new knowledge of his mother like precious raindrops in drought. Richard had removed all photographs of Grace after her death, had forbidden the staff from mentioning her to Ethan. Each tiny revelation Samuel offered was a treasure Ethan stored carefully in his heart. As autumn painted the Kentucky hillsides, in flames of red and gold, Ethan and Redemption's secret sessions progressed. The boy learned to guide the horse with subtle shifts of his weight and gentle hands on the reins. The horse learned to respond to these cues with a sensitivity that belied his massive strength. Together, they ventured further from the old stable, down hidden trails where Ethan could taste freedom in the crisp morning air. They were returning from one such morning ride, Ethan's cheeks flushed with cold and exhilaration, when disaster struck. Richard's sleek black Bentley appeared on the drive, returning unexpectedly from what should have been a 3-day business trip to Louisville. From his position on Redemption's back, with Samuel walking beside them, Ethan was fully exposed. No longer the hidden son, but a boy astride a powerful horse, defying every limitation his father had placed upon him. The car slowed to a stop. Through the tinted window, Ethan could feel rather than see his father's gaze. The silence stretched, broken only by Redemption's soft snorting and the rustle of autumn leaves beneath his hooves. Then, without warning, the car accelerated, spraying gravel as it continued toward the house. "He saw us," Ethan whispered, sudden fear replacing the joy of moments before. Samuel's expression grew grave. "Get back to the stable, quick as you can. I'll deal with your father." But as they turned Redemption toward the safety of the old barn, Ethan knew with cold certainty that something fundamental had changed. His small rebellion, his taste of freedom, neither would go unpunished by Richard Mitchell, a man whose reputation was built on controlling every aspect of his carefully curated world. And in that moment, as the morning sun broke fully over, the Kentucky hills illuminating the estate in deceptive golden light, Ethan felt Redemption's muscles tense beneath him, as if the horse too sensed the gathering storm. The consequences of being discovered came swiftly. By nightfall, Richard Mitchell had fired Samuel without severance, citing dangerous and unauthorized activities with the Mitchell heir as justification. The old stable hand was given 1 hour to collect his belongings from the small cottage he'd occupied for 4 decades. "It's not right," Mrs. Pembroke whispered to the cook as they watched from the kitchen window while Samuel loaded his few possessions into his rusted pickup truck. "That man raised Mr. Mitchell, taught him to ride his first pony." Ethan, confined to his room with the door locked from the outside, pressed his forehead against the cool glass of his window. From this angle, he could just make out the curved driveway where Samuel's truck idled. The old man looked up suddenly, as if sensing Ethan's gaze, and raised one weathered hand in a solemn farewell. Then he was gone, and with him Ethan's connection to redemption, to freedom, to the only person who spoke of his mother with love, rather than clinical detachment. For 3 days, Ethan was kept isolated, meals delivered silently by staff who'd been warned against engaging with him. His tutoring sessions were cancelled. His wheelchair was taken for maintenance, leaving him dependent on the narrow bed and window seat for mobility. It was a punishment designed to break whatever independence had begun to flourish in him. On the evening of the 3rd day, Richard Mitchell finally entered his son's room, his tall frame imposing in the doorway, expression unreadable in the dim lamplight. "What you did was dangerous and foolish," he said without preamble, his voice controlled and distant, as if addressing a disappointing business associate rather than his child. "You could have been killed." Ethan met his father's gaze. "I wasn't in danger. Redemption takes care of me." "A horse is not a caretaker," Richard replied coldly. "It's an animal, an investment, property. Is that what I am too?" The words escaped before Ethan could contain them, years of silent questions crystallizing into one. For a moment, something flickered across Richard's face. Surprise, perhaps, that the silent, compliant child could produce such directness. It vanished, quickly replaced by his usual mask of detached authority. "You are my son," he stated, "and as such, certain expectations exist. You will not endanger yourself. You will not create situations that invite gossip or speculation. You will focus on your studies and development of skills appropriate to your condition." "Like what? Disappearing when company comes? Pretending I don't exist? Richard straightened his Italian silk tie with manicured fingers. Your wheelchair will be returned tomorrow. Your new tutor starts Monday, and the horse is being moved to the main stable where it can be properly supervised. His name is Redemption, Ethan said softly, and he's not an it. His father turned to leave, pausing with his hand on the doorknob. One more thing. If I ever find you on a horse again, I'll have the animal destroyed. Is that clear? The threat landed exactly as intended, driving the air from Ethan's lungs. He nodded mutely, knowing his father meant every word. When the door closed, Ethan allowed himself to feel the full weight of his loss. Not just Samuel and the rides, but the brief, shining sense that he could be more than his limitations, more than his father's embarrassment. In the silence of his room, he wept. For the first time since his mother's funeral, weeks passed in a monotony of enforced routine. The new tutor, Mr. Hargrove, was efficient but cold, focusing on academics without the warmth or conversation that had made learning enjoyable with his previous teacher. The staff remained distant, clearly under instructions to limit their interactions with him. His wheelchair was returned, but his movements were more closely monitored, the East Wing essentially becoming his prison. From his window, Ethan could see the path to the old stables, now overgrown from disuse. He imagined redemption in his new surroundings, the antiseptic cleanliness of the main stable, surrounded by high-strung racing prospects and grooms who saw him as nothing more than damaged goods taking up valuable space. It was Mrs. Pembroke who finally broke the silence surrounding Redemption's fate. Bringing Ethan's dinner tray one evening, she lingered longer than usual, straightening items on his desk that needed no straightening. "That horse isn't eating," she said quietly, back turned to him as if speaking to the wall. "They say he's refusing food, standing in his stall facing the wall all day. Mr. Jenkins thinks he might be falling ill." Ethan's heart constricted. Has anyone checked his leg? Sometimes it bothers him when the weather changes. "No one there knows him like you did," Mrs. Pembroke replied. Her eyes met his briefly. Such a shame to see a proud creature waste away. The message was clear. Just as Ethan was fading under his father's oppressive control, so too was Redemption. Two beings connected by more than circumstance, both suffering from forced separation. That night, after the house had fallen silent, Ethan made his decision. Using the skills he'd developed, navigating the mansion's many hallways, he maneuvered, his wheelchair silently toward the service elevator that connected to the kitchen. The night security guard, Mr. Phelps, had a habit of dozing after midnight in the small office near the main entrance. If Ethan timed it correctly, he could reach the kitchen, exit through the delivery entrance, and make his way across the lawns to the main stable. The journey was painstaking. Every creak of his wheelchair wheels on the wooden floors sounded thunderous in the silent house. The elevator, normally avoided due to its aged machinery, descended with agonizing slowness. But determination drove him forward, an inner strength he'd never fully acknowledged, propelling each careful movement. Outside, the autumn night was crisp, the moon providing just enough light to navigate by. The wheelchair struggled on the manicured lawn, requiring all of Ethan's upper body strength to force it across terrain it wasn't designed for. By the time he reached the gravel path leading to the main stables, his arms trembled with exhaustion, and his breath came in short, white puffs in the cold air. The main stable was a modern marvel of architectural design. 24 stalls, with automatic waterers, climate control, and surveillance cameras. Ethan had never been allowed inside. It was the heart of his father's empire, the showpiece he presented to investors and racing officials. But Ethan knew the security code from years of overhearing conversations, of watching from windows, of existing on the periphery of his father's world. The keypad accepted the code with a soft beep, and the side door unlocked. Ethan held his breath, waiting for alarms, for shouts, for discovery. When none came, he pushed forward into the warm, hay-scented interior. Unlike the old stable's comfortable disorder, this building was clinically efficient. Motion sensor lights activated at his movement, illuminating polished concrete floors, and gleaming brass nameplates on each stall door. Ethan moved down the center aisle, scanning the names of horses worth millions, future Derby contenders, broodmares of impeccable lineage. At the very end, in a stall smaller than the others and lacking the elaborate ventilation systems of its neighbors, he found Redemption. The once proud stallion stood with his head lowered, his coat dull under the artificial lights. He didn't turn at Ethan's approach. "Red," Ethan whispered, reaching a hand toward the stall door. "It's me." The horse's ears flickered, the only sign he'd heard. Ethan stretched further, fingers trembling as they attempted to reach through the bars to touch the familiar muzzle. The distance was too great, his wheelchair positioned too low. "Please," Ethan whispered, tears stinging his eyes. "I'm here." Slowly, as if waking from a deep sleep, Redemption turned. His dark eyes, once so bright with intelligence, seemed dimmed by the weeks of separation. But as his gaze fell on Ethan, something sparked within them. The stallion took one tentative step forward, then another, until finally his muzzle stretched toward the boy's outstretched hand. The touch was electric. Warm breath against cold fingers, recognition flowing between them like a current. Ethan felt the knot in his chest loosen for the first time since Samuel's departure. For long minutes, they simply existed in each other's presence, reconnecting across the barrier that had been placed between them. "I can't get you out," Ethan said, softly stroking the velvet nose. "But I'll come back, I promise." As if understanding, Redemption pressed his head more firmly against Ethan's palm. In that moment, the boy made a silent vow, not just to return, but to find a way to ensure that neither of them would live imprisoned forever. The journey back to the house was harder, fatigue making his arms less responsive, the night air seeping into his bones with numbing persistence. Dawn was approaching by the time he navigated back through the kitchen entrance and toward the service elevator. As the doors slid open, Ethan found himself face to face with Mrs. Pembroke, dressed in her robe, her expression a mixture of concern and resignation. "Your father knows," she said simply. Ethan's heart sank. "How?" "The stable cameras. They send alerts to his phone." In the silent journey back to his room, Ethan prepared himself for the worst, more restrictions, perhaps even the fulfillment of his father's threat against Redemption. But as Mrs. Pembroke helped him into bed, her touch uncharacteristically gentle, she leaned close to his ear. "Sometimes," she whispered, "the bravest thing we can do is survive until help comes." Then, pressing something into his hand, she straightened and left the room. In his palm lay a small, tarnished locket. Opening it with trembling fingers, Ethan found himself staring at a miniature photograph of his mother, her eyes kind and determined, so similar to his own. Outside his window, the first light of dawn illuminated the rolling Kentucky hills. In the distance, the main stable gleamed white against the landscape, housing both his greatest friend and his greatest fear. But for the first time since Samuel's departure, Ethan felt a flicker of something beyond despair. A tiny flame of hope, kindled by the connection that remained unbroken despite all efforts to sever it. With the locket clutched tightly in his hand, Ethan finally surrendered to exhaustion, dreaming not of wheelchair ramps and locked doors, but of open fields and the rhythm of hoofbeats beneath him, dreams of freedom that no amount of surveillance could monitor or control. The winter that settled over the Mitchell estate brought with it a coldness that went beyond the record-low temperatures gripping Kentucky. 3 days after Ethan's nighttime journey to the main stables, Richard called a meeting with his executive staff, his legal team, and a clinical specialist from the Whitehaven Institute, an exclusive rehabilitation facility in New Hampshire. Known for its discretion in handling troubled heirs of wealthy families. Ethan, officially confined to his rooms with what the household staff was told was a severe case of pneumonia, learned of these developments through whispers and half-heard conversations. Mrs. Pembroke, now his only ally within the house, brought him not just meals, but scraps of information gleaned from servicing the rooms where these meetings took place. "They're calling it specialized care," she told him one evening, her voice barely audible as she straightened his bookshelves. "Papers being drawn up. Some doctor from New Hampshire has been here twice now." "When?" Ethan asked, the single word laden with fear he couldn't disguise. "After the holidays. Your father has investors visiting from Dubai next week. He wants everything settled before they leave." Her eyes met his briefly. "The horse is being sold. Paperwork came through yesterday." The dual blow left Ethan breathless. Institutionalization for him. Separation, perhaps worse, for redemption. His father was systematically eliminating what he perceived as weaknesses in his carefully constructed world. That night, clutching his mother's locket, Ethan made a decision. If he remained passive, both he and redemption were doomed. He needed help beyond the walls of the estate, but his isolation had been nearly complete throughout his life. Who could he possibly reach out to? The answer came from an unexpected source. Mr. Hargrove, his cold and efficient tutor, arrived the following morning with the usual stack of assignments. As he laid out the day's schedule, he slipped a small business card beneath Ethan's mathematics textbook. "Your history lesson today concerns citizen advocacy and legal protections under the Americans with Disabilities Act," he said, his voice its usual monotone, but his eyes conveying a message Ethan couldn't quite decipher. "I expect a full essay on the subject by tomorrow." When Mr. Hargrove left for his mid-morning break, Ethan examined the card. "Sarah Williams, MSW, Child Advocacy Services," it read, with a phone number and email address. On the back, in neat handwriting, "Document everything. Call any time." Hope and terror warred within him. Reaching outside the Mitchell estate's carefully guarded boundaries had always been forbidden. His father controlled every aspect of communication. The house had no landlines accessible to Ethan, and he'd never been provided with a cell phone or unsupervised computer access. His education conducted on closed networks monitored by Mitchell Technologies. Yet, the alternative was Whitehaven. Whatever that truly meant. Mrs. Pembroke provided the final piece of the puzzle that evening when she smuggled in her personal cell phone, hidden beneath Ethan's dinner tray. 20 minutes, she whispered. "I'm supposed to be doing inventory in the East Wing storage. No one will look for me until then." With trembling fingers, Ethan dialed the number from the card. Each ring seemed to last an eternity, his heart pounding so loudly he feared it would alert the security staff. "Sarah Williams," answered a clear, professional voice. "My name is Ethan Mitchell," he began, words tumbling out in a rush. "I'm 10 years old. My father is Richard Mitchell. He's sending me away to some place called Whitehaven, and I need help." There was a brief silence on the other end. Then, "I'm listening, Ethan. Tell me everything you can." For the next 15 minutes, Ethan poured out his story, his lifelong isolation, his father's emotional neglect, the plans he'd overheard, his fears for both himself and redemption. Sarah asked pointed, careful questions, never expressing shock or disbelief, treating him with a seriousness no adult besides Samuel had ever shown him. "Ethan, what you're describing constitutes severe neglect and potentially abuse," she said. "Finally. I need to start building a case file immediately, but I need evidence, documentation. Can you safely collect any? I don't know, he admitted. I'm watched all the time. Is there anyone besides Mrs. Pembroke who might help? Anyone who has seen how you're treated? Ethan thought of the rotating staff, most of whom avoided eye contact with him at his father's implicit direction. Then he remembered. Dr. Warner. She comes to do my physical evaluations every 6 months. She asked questions once about why I wasn't in school, why I didn't have friends. My father was angry afterward. That's excellent, Ethan. Medical professionals are mandated reporters. Sarah's voice became urgent. I need you to do something very brave. The next time you see Dr. Warner or any medical professional, you must tell them directly that you feel unsafe and ask for help. Use those exact words. They are legally obligated to report it. As Mrs. Pembroke's anxious face appeared at the door, Ethan rushed through the final arrangements. Sarah would begin investigating immediately, looking into the Whitehaven Institute and gathering information on the Mitchell estate's unusual handling of Richard's only heir. She would attempt to contact Dr. Warner directly. Meanwhile, Ethan would document everything he could and find a way to communicate again as soon as possible. You're not alone anymore, Ethan, were Sarah's final words before the call ended. What your father is doing isn't right, and it isn't legal. Hold on, help is coming. Those words sustained him through the following days as Richard's plans accelerated. Household staff began packing select items from Ethan's room. A medical evaluation was scheduled with an unfamiliar doctor, not Dr. Warner, who asked no personal questions and focused solely on Ethan's physical condition. Legal documents were delivered daily to Richard's study, their contents unknown, but their purpose clear. On Christmas Eve, with the estate decorated lavishly for the annual Mitchell Industries Holiday Gala, Ethan was moved to the guest house, a smaller but elegantly appointed building at the furthest edge of the property. The official explanation to the household staff was that renovations were beginning on the east wing. The reality, as Mrs. Pembroke whispered while helping with the transfer, was that the Dubai investors were bringing their families, including children, for the holiday festivities. He doesn't want questions about why you're not participating, she explained, her voice tight with suppressed anger. The guest house, though comfortable, was effectively a more isolated prison. No staff except Mrs. Pembroke was assigned there. The security system was updated with biometric locks that only Richard and the head of security could override. Ethan's window overlooked not the stables or the main house, but the dense woods that bordered the Mitchell property, beautiful but remote, limiting his ability to observe the comings and goings at the main estate. It was there, on the morning of December 26th, that Richard finally confronted Ethan directly about the future. Dressed impeccably in a charcoal suit despite the early hour, he stood in the guest house living room while Ethan sat in his wheelchair, both of them separated by an antique coffee table that seemed as vast as an ocean. The arrangements are finalized, Richard said, his tone businesslike. You'll be departing for Whitehaven on January 3rd. They specialize in cases like yours, children with physical limitations and behavioral concerns. What behavioral concerns? Ethan asked, surprising himself with his steadiness. Richard's expression tightened fractionally. Your unauthorized excursions? Your unhealthy attachment to a dangerous animal? Your apparent inability to understand your place and role given your condition. My place, Ethan repeated. You mean hidden away, pretending I don't exist. I mean safe, protected, receiving appropriate care. Richard straightened his already immaculate cuffs. Whitehaven will provide structure that has been lacking here. Their success rate with difficult cases is exceptional. And what about my education? My future? Something flickered in Richard's eyes. Perhaps surprise at the questions, at the sudden evidence of a mind that had been forming its own thoughts behind the silent compliance. Whitehaven has educational facilities. As for your future, the Mitchell Trust will ensure your comfort and care indefinitely. But not my freedom, Ethan said quietly. Richard's jaw tightened. Freedom is relative, Ethan, even more so for someone in your situation. Whitehaven offers appropriate freedoms within safe boundaries. The conversation continued in this vein, Richard outlining what he called opportunities at Whitehaven, Ethan asking pointed questions that increasingly irritated his father. It was the longest direct interaction they'd had in years, possibly ever, and beneath it ran an undercurrent that both recognized but neither acknowledged. This wasn't about Ethan's well-being. It was about Richard's image, his comfort, his world, operating exactly as he designed it. As Richard prepared to leave, Ethan asked the question that had been burning inside him. What about redemption? His father paused at the door, his back to Ethan. The horse has been sold to a processing facility in Canada. The transport leaves tomorrow. The words landed like physical blows. Processing facility, a euphemism for slaughter. Redemption, intelligent, gentle redemption, was being sent to his death, his only crime being the bond he'd formed with Richard Mitchell's inconvenient son. You can't, Ethan whispered, voice breaking. He's not just some animal. He matters. Richard turned, his expression cold, but with something else beneath it, something almost like fear. That's exactly the problem, Ethan. You've never understood what truly matters. Attachments to things. Yes, and things that have no real value except what we assign them. It's a weakness I hoped you would outgrow. Like me, Ethan said, the realization crystallizing. I'm just a thing to you too, something without real value. For a fraction of a second, Richard seemed taken aback, then his expression hardened. Rest today. Begin packing tomorrow. Mrs. Pembroke will assist you with the essentials. Whitehaven provides uniforms and necessary items. After he left, Ethan sat motionless, the full weight of what was happening crushing down on him. Sarah Williams had promised help, but how could it arrive in time? The Whitehaven transfer was just over a week away. Redemption would be gone tomorrow. When Mrs. Pembroke arrived with lunch, she found him still in the same position, tear tracks dried on his face. I need to call Sarah again, he said immediately. It's an emergency. Mrs. Pembroke shook her head sadly. I can't, child. They've implemented new security protocols after the holiday event. Staff devices are being checked at entry and exit points. Mine would be discovered. Despair threatened to overwhelm him, but something in Mrs. Pembroke's expression made him pause. She wasn't meeting his eyes directly, instead busying herself with arranging his lunch tray. As she set down his napkin, he noticed a small slip of paper beneath it. Your father has requested your presence at the family cemetery tomorrow morning, she said, her voice carefully neutral. A visit to your mother's resting place before your journey. The car will collect you at 10. When she left, Ethan unfolded the paper. In the same neat handwriting he recognized from the back of Sarah's business card, evidence being gathered, Dr. Warner cooperating, dangerous situation confirmed, stay visible, accept all invitations outside secure areas. The message was clear. Sarah was building a case, but she needed Ethan in public view, not hidden away in the guest house where access to him could be controlled or denied. The cemetery visit, his first trip beyond the estate grounds in years, was an opportunity. But it was also a farewell, his mother's grave. The day Redemption would be transported to slaughter. One day, closer to Whitehaven, Richard was systematically severing every connection Ethan had, preparing to erase him from the visible world. That night, alone in the guest house that felt more like a waiting room than a home, Ethan clutched his mother's locket and made a final, desperate plan. If tomorrow was to be his only chance to be seen, to be saved, and perhaps Redemption's only chance as well, then he would have to find courage he wasn't sure he possessed. Outside, a winter storm gathered strength, snow beginning to fall across the Kentucky hills, covering the Mitchell estate in a deceptive blanket of pristine white. In the distance, the lights of the main stable, where Redemption waited unknowingly for morning, glowed faintly through the swirling flakes, like a beacon calling Ethan toward a moment that would determine both their fates. Morning broke over. The Mitchell estate, the winter storm having passed in the night, leaving behind a landscape transformed. The rolling hills of Kentucky horse country glittered under a fresh blanket of snow, deceptively peaceful beneath a sky that had cleared to a piercing blue, but nothing about this day would bring peace to Ethan Mitchell. At precisely 9:30, Mrs. Pembroke arrived to help him prepare for the cemetery visit. Her movements were efficient but gentle as she helped him into the rarely worn formal clothes Richard had demanded for the occasion, a dark wool suit that felt like armor against his skin. "Your father has invited Reverend Collins to accompany you," she said quietly as she straightened his tie. "A small ceremony of remembrance before your departure." Ethan nodded, understanding the subtext. Reverend Collins was not just the pastor at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, but also a long-standing Mitchell family ally, someone who had never questioned Richard's narrative about his disabled son being too fragile for public life. His presence meant witnesses, but not necessarily allies. "There's a transport truck at the main stables," Ethan said, glancing toward the window though the stables weren't visible from this angle. "Is it for Redemption?" Mrs. Pembroke's hands stilled momentarily. "Yes, scheduled to leave at noon." Her eyes met his, conveying a message she couldn't speak aloud with security cameras potentially monitoring them. "Whatever you're thinking, child, be careful, but be brave." At 10 o'clock precisely, Richard's Bentley pulled up to the guest house. The driver, a taciturn security officer named Maddox, loaded Ethan's wheelchair into the trunk after transferring him to the back seat beside his father. Reverend Collins sat in the front passenger seat, his silver hair and clerical collar visible. "A meaningful morning for reflection," the Reverend said, turning slightly to address Ethan. "Your father tells me you'll be beginning a new journey soon. A specialized school that can better accommodate your needs." "Yes, sir," Ethan replied, the words ashen in his mouth. "Very specialized." The Mitchell family cemetery occupied a small, pristine hill overlooking the estate's eastern pastures. Dating back to the 1850s, it contained the remains of 5 generations of Mitchells, successful horse breeders, businessmen, and Kentucky socialites. Grace Mitchell's grave, marked by an elegant white marble angel, stood slightly apart from the older plots, as if even in death she remained an outsider to the Mitchell dynasty. As Maddox parked the car and began unloading the wheelchair, Ethan noticed another vehicle already waiting, a black SUV with tinted windows and government plates. His pulse quickened. This wasn't part of his father's carefully choreographed morning. Richard noticed too, his expression darkening. "Who authorized visitors?" he demanded of Maddox. "The cemetery was supposed to be secured." "Unknown, sir," Maddox replied, his face impassive. "They arrived about 10 minutes ago. Credentials checked out with security at the main gate." Before Richard could respond, the SUV's door opened and an older woman stepped out, tall, with silver-streaked dark hair and familiar eyes. Eyes that Ethan recognized instantly from photographs he'd studied in secret. His mother's eyes. His eyes. "Martha Johnson," she announced, approaching with confident strides despite her age. "Grace's mother, here to pay respects to my daughter and finally meet my grandson." Richard went rigid beside Ethan. "This is a private family moment, Martha. Your presence wasn't requested." "And yet here I am," she replied coolly. "After 10 years of denied visitation requests, blocked phone calls, and returned letters. Remarkable what a court order can accomplish when properly enforced." The second SUV door opened, revealing Sarah Williams, dressed professionally in a dark suit, a leather portfolio clutched in her hands. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, nodding curtly. "I'm Sarah Williams, Child Protective Services. We have some urgent matters to discuss regarding Ethan's welfare." The temperature seemed to drop further as Richard's expression hardened from annoyance to something far more dangerous. "My son's welfare is not open for discussion, particularly with strangers. Reverend Collins and I are here for a private moment of remembrance before Ethan departs for his new school. Whatever concerns you believe you have can be addressed through proper channels, meaning my attorneys." Sarah remained unmoved. "I'm afraid this can't wait. We have documented evidence of concerning conditions and potential neglect that require immediate investigation. Dr. Eleanor Warner has filed a formal report based on her observations during Ethan's medical examinations, and we've received additional testimony from former household staff." "Samuel," Ethan whispered, hope surging through him. "This is absurd," Richard snapped, placing a hand on Ethan's wheelchair as if to physically assert his control. "Ethan receives the finest care money can buy. His condition requires specialized handling, which is precisely what the Whitehaven Institute will provide." "Whitehaven," Martha repeated, her voice heavy with recognition. "The place where inconvenient heirs disappear behind luxurious facades and legal guardianships are quietly transferred to corporate trustees." She stepped closer to Ethan, her eyes brimming with emotion. "Your mother made me promise that if anything happened to her, I would make sure you were safe. I've spent 10 years fighting to keep that promise." Ethan stared up at her, seeing not just his mother's eyes, but her determination reflected in this woman he'd never been allowed to know. "He's sending redemption to Slaughter," he blurted out. "Today, noon." Martha looked confused, but Sarah's expression sharpened. "The horse you mentioned in our call?" "Yes," Ethan confirmed. "He's being transported to a processing facility in Canada just because I care about him." "This is ridiculous," Richard interrupted. "A business decision about an underperforming asset has nothing to do with any of this. Reverend, please escort Ethan to his mother's grave while I deal with this intrusion." But Reverend Collins, who had been observing the exchange with increasing discomfort, seemed reluctant to involve himself further. "Richard, perhaps we should—" Whatever he intended to suggest was cut short by the sound of an approaching vehicle. Not the smooth purr of an executive car, but the rattling growl of an aged pickup truck. It pulled to a stop beside the gathered group, and Samuel emerged, his weathered face grave but determined. "Thought I might find you all here," he said, nodding respectfully to Martha and Sarah before focusing on Ethan. "Came to say my piece before I couldn't." "You are terminated for cause and are trespassing on private property," Richard said coldly. "Security will escort you out immediately." "Security's a bit busy at the main house," Samuel replied, a hint of satisfaction in his voice. "Seems there's quite a gathering of folks asking questions. Reporters from the Lexington Herald, some official-looking types with badges, even Dr. Warner herself." Ethan's heart leapt. The plan was working. Sarah had mobilized exactly the public visibility she'd mentioned in her note, But Richard was far from defeated. His expression shifted from anger to calculation, the businessman's mind visibly recalibrating to this new threat. "Whatever performance you've orchestrated won't change anything," he said smoothly. "Ethan is my son, and medical decisions regarding his care remain my legal right. By tomorrow, this will all be handled appropriately, and Whitehaven's legal team will ensure his transfer proceeds as planned." Is that before or after you explain why you've kept your son hidden from society, denied him proper education, and systematically isolated him from family? Martha challenged, moving to stand protectively beside Ethan's wheelchair. "Or before you explain the financial arrangements with Whitehaven?" Sarah added, opening her portfolio. "Our investigation has uncovered some interesting documents regarding the Mitchell Trust and proposed guardianship transfers that would effectively give you control of Ethan's inheritance from his mother even after he turns 18. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Richard's face. The assembled group had formed a protective semicircle around Ethan. His grandmother, Sarah, Samuel, even Reverend Collins had shifted slightly away from Richard's side. The power dynamics were visibly shifting, but Richard Mitchell hadn't built an empire by surrendering easily. "This is all very dramatic," he said, regaining his composure, "but ultimately futile. Ethan, it's time to pay respects to your mother. The rest of this situation can be addressed later." He reached for the handles of Ethan's wheelchair. At that exact moment, a sound cut through the tense standoff, the distant but unmistakable whinny of a horse in distress, followed by shouts from the direction of the main stables. All heads turned toward the commotion, visible through the bare winter trees as figures running across the snow-covered grounds. "Redemption," Ethan whispered, a certainty blooming within him. As if summoned by his name, a large bay form emerged from the trees at the bottom of the cemetery hill. Redemption, moving with surprising speed despite his damaged leg, his powerful body breaking through the snowdrifts. Behind him, stable hands and security personnel gave chase, but the horse was driven by something beyond their understanding. "How did he—" Richard began, but Samuel cut him off. "That transport team you hired didn't know how to handle a horse. With his spirit," the old man said, a hint of pride in his voice. "Some animals know when they're headed to their end." Redemption thundered up the hill, his breath coming in great white clouds, his scarred forehead catching the winter sunlight. The cemetery's wrought iron gate stood no chance against his determined charge. He burst through it with the force of his massive chest, sending it swinging wildly on its hinges. For a moment, the tableau froze in time. The horse standing proudly at the cemetery entrance, his intelligent eyes fixed on Ethan. The boy in his wheelchair, face transformed by joy and fear, Richard Mitchell, his careful control visibly slipping, and the witnesses, forming a protective barrier between father and son. Then everything happened at once. Richard lunged toward Ethan, whether to protect him from the approaching horse or to assert control, no one could say. Martha stepped between them, her small frame surprisingly formidable. Sarah moved to block Richard's path, portfolio falling. Forgotten to the snow, Samuel whistled sharply, a signal Redemption recognized from countless training sessions, causing the horse to halt his charge, standing tall and alert just yards away. "Stay back," Richard shouted, genuine fear in his voice now. "That animal is dangerous." But Ethan, seizing the moment of confusion, did something he'd never attempted before, using all the strength in his arms, strength built through years of maneuvering. His wheelchair and months of secret riding sessions, he pushed himself up and out of the chair. He fell forward onto the snow-covered ground, the cold shocking against his hands and face. Then, with a determination that silenced everyone present, he began to drag himself toward Redemption, his useless legs trailing behind him, arms pulling. His body through the snow inch by painful inch. "Ethan!" Multiple voices called out, but he didn't stop. Richard moved to intercept him, but Samuel stepped forward, placing a hand firmly on his shoulder. "Let him go," the old man said, his voice low, but carrying the weight of decades of suppressed judgment. "For once in your life, let your son be who he is." The distance between boy and horse closed gradually, agonizingly. Ethan's formal clothes became soaked with snow, his face flushed with effort, but his eyes never left Redemption's. The horse, understanding some deeper communication, lowered his massive head until his muzzle touched Ethan's outstretched hand. In that moment, witnessed by all present, the social worker gathering evidence of neglect, the grandmother reclaiming her lost connection, the stable hand who had fostered their bond, the reverend questioning his own complicity, and the father whose control was crumbling. The truth was undeniable. Here was not a defective child to be hidden away, but a brave soul fighting for connection. Not a dangerous animal to be discarded, but a loyal protector offering unconditional acceptance. A camera flashed. Maddox, the driver who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, had his phone raised, capturing the powerful image. Richard spun toward him in rage, but the man met his gaze steadily. "My sister has a son with cerebral palsy," he said, simply. "Been watching how you treat this boy for months. Didn't sit right." The sound of approaching vehicles signaled the arrival of more witnesses, the reporters and officials Samuel had mentioned. Richard Mitchell, master of public perception, looked from the growing crowd to his son, still on the ground beside the massive horse, and something in his expression shifted. Not surrender, not quite remorse, but perhaps the first glimmer of recognition that the world he had so carefully constructed was built on a foundation of shame that could no longer stand. In the days that followed, the Mitchell estate became the center of a storm that extended far beyond Kentucky. The image of Ethan and Redemption in the snow-covered cemetery, a boy with paralyzed legs who had crawled through snow to reach his only friend, became a symbol that resonated across social media and traditional news outlets alike. The narrative of the business mogul who had hidden his disabled son from the world while preparing to institutionalize him and destroy his beloved horse struck a chord that transcended political divides. Martha Johnson, backed by a team of attorneys and disability rights advocates, filed for emergency custody of her grandson. The evidence compiled by Sarah Williams, including Dr. Warner's medical documentation of Ethan's isolated conditions, Samuel's testimony about the years of emotional neglect, and the damning financial documents revealing Richard's attempts to control his son's inheritance, created a legal case that even Mitchell's high-powered attorneys couldn't easily dismiss. For Ethan, the transformation came in stages. First, temporary residence with his grandmother in her modest Lexington home, where photographs of his mother adorned the walls and stories of her childhood filled the previously empty spaces in his understanding of himself. Then, evaluation by medical and educational specialists who marveled at his intelligence and resilience despite years of isolation. Finally, integration into a specialized school where, for the first time, he met other children with various disabilities who were nonetheless treated as complete, valuable human beings. Redemption found sanctuary at a therapeutic riding center just outside Lexington, a facility that agreed to never use him for slaughter or breeding, but to honor his unique bond with Ethan by maintaining him as a special resident. The damage to his leg, properly treated by veterinarians who actually cared, proved less debilitating than previously believed. Under proper care, his coat regained its shine, his eyes their intelligence and spirit. Richard Mitchell, facing both legal consequences and devastating public opinion, retreated from Kentucky to his international properties. Mitchell Industries underwent a leadership restructuring, with the board of directors distancing themselves from its founder's personal scandal. The Whitehaven Institute faced its own investigation, its practices regarding difficult heirs suddenly subject to uncomfortable scrutiny. On a warm spring afternoon, 6 months after the cemetery confrontation, Ethan sat in a specially designed saddle atop Redemption's broad back, guiding the horse along a gentle trail that wound through the rolling hills of the Therapeutic Riding Center. Beside him rode his grandmother on a placid mare, her silver hair catching the sunlight. "Do you think he ever loved me?" Ethan asked suddenly, the question that had haunted him for years finally finding voice. "Even for a moment?" Martha considered this carefully, giving her grandson's question the respect it deserved. "I believe your father loves the idea of legacy, of continuation," she said finally. "He never learned how to love people for who they are, only for what they represent or what they can do for him. That's not your failure, Ethan. It's his." Ethan absorbed this, his hand absently stroking Redemption's neck. "I used to dream about him suddenly changing, seeing me differently. And now," she prompted gently, "now I dream about the riding. In a program," he replied, a new confidence in his voice, "about helping other kids like me find what I found with Red. The Therapeutic Riding Center, recognizing Ethan's natural gift with both horses and children with disabilities, had invited him to become a junior volunteer. Under supervision, he had begun helping younger children experience the same freedom and connection he had discovered with Redemption. The horse, once designated for slaughter, had proven remarkably gentle with the center's most vulnerable visitors, as if understanding the importance of his role. As they crested a hill overlooking the facility's main buildings, Ethan could see Samuel, now employed as the center's head stable manager, working with a new arrival, a young girl in a wheelchair, not unlike his former one. Her face shone with the same wonder he had felt during his first secret rides, that moment of transcending physical limitations through connection with something larger than himself. "Mom would have loved this place," he said, the words emerging, without the pain that had always accompanied thoughts of his mother. "She would have," Martha agreed, tears glistening in her eyes. "But more importantly, she would have loved the person you're becoming, not despite everything that's happened, but because of how you've risen above it." Redemption's ears flickered back, listening to their conversation as he always seemed to do. Then he nickered softly, sensing Ethan's emotions in that mysterious way that had first drawn them together. Two damaged beings recognizing in each other not weakness, but unmapped strength. The settlement with Richard, negotiated through teams of attorneys, had established a trust for Ethan's care and education that would transition to his full control at adulthood. But the most meaningful outcome had been Richard's agreement to transfer ownership of the old Mitchell stable to the Therapeutic Riding Center, expanding their facilities and ensuring their financial stability for years to come. Whether this represented remorse, strategic damage control, or simply a businessman cutting his losses remained unclear. Richard himself had not attempted direct contact with his son since the cemetery confrontation, communicating only through intermediaries and legal representatives. The gulf between them remained vast and possibly unbridgeable, a reality Ethan was learning to accept without letting it define him. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the Kentucky landscape that had witnessed both his imprisonment and his liberation, Ethan guided Redemption toward the main arena where other children waited for their riding lessons. The horse moved with confident strides, his damaged legs strengthened through proper care and regular exercise, his spirit fully restored. Together, They entered the bright, open space where once isolated children discovered connection, where fear gave way to confidence, where limitations became simply parameters rather than prison walls. Staff members nodded respectfully to Ethan, no longer the hidden Mitchell heir, but a valued member of their community. His journey and bond with redemption, having inspired a program specifically for pairing rescued horses with children facing similar challenges. As redemption came to a gentle stop beside the mounting ramp where the young girl waited, her eyes wide with anticipation and nervousness, Ethan leaned forward to whisper in the horse's ear, "Ready to help someone else find their freedom, old friend?" Redemption's response was to lower his head to the girl's eye level, blowing softly through his nostrils in gentle greeting. The same gesture of acceptance he had once offered to a lonely boy locked away in an opulent prison. The girl's face transformed with delight as she tentatively reached toward the velvet muzzle. In that moment of new connection being formed, Ethan Mitchell, no longer defined by what he couldn't do or by his father's shame, felt the final pieces of his old identity fall away. What remained was no longer just survival or even recovery, but possibility. The future stretched before him not as a narrowing path of limitations, but as an expanding horizon of purpose, built on the unshakable foundation of a bond that had saved them both. And redemption, the scarred stallion once destined for destruction, stood steady beneath the weight of not just his rider, but all he represented. Second chances, unexpected strength, and the transformative power of being truly seen for who you are, rather than what others believe you cannot become. Dear listeners, if Ethan and Redemption's journey has touched something deep within you, know that you are not alone. Their story reminds us that true strength often emerges from our most vulnerable moments, and that the bonds we form with those who see us for who we truly are can change the course of our lives forever. Stories like these matter. They remind us of our shared humanity and the power of compassion to transform even the darkest circumstances. If you've been moved by what you've heard today, please subscribe to our channel for more tales that illuminate the resilience of the human spirit and the healing power of connection. Leave a comment sharing which moment resonated most with you. Was it Ethan's brave crawl through the snow, the silent understanding between boy and horse, or perhaps the community that ultimately rose to protect them both? Remember that in our world, just as in Ethan's, seemingly small acts of kindness and courage can create ripples that change lives. Every share, every subscription helps us continue bringing these stories of hope and redemption to those who need them most. Until our next journey together, may you find your own redemption, whatever form it may take, and the courage to reach for it even when the path seems impossible.